I stood in the courthouse hallway, staring at the woman who gave birth to me 32 years ago. She rolled her eyes like I was wasting her time. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from rage I'd buried for 3 decades. In 10 minutes, I'd walk into that courtroom and fight for $3.9 million my grandfather left me. The same parents who abandoned me at 3 months old were now suing for every penny. My mother laughed with her lawyer, diamonds glittering on her fingers. I remembered my grandfather's final words, "Promise me you'll fight for this, son." The courtroom doors swung open. The story I'm about to tell you starts on a cold November morning, 32 years ago. I don't remember it, obviously. I was 3 months old. But my grandfather told me about it when I was old enough to understand. He said he heard knocking on his front door at 6 in the morning. When he opened it, nobody was there. Just a car seat on his doorstep with a baby inside, wrapped in a blue blanket, and a note taped to the handle. The note was short. I've seen it. My grandfather kept it in a locked drawer his entire life. It said, "We're not ready to be parents. Please take care of him. We're sorry." It was signed by my mother, Diane, and my father, Roger. My grandfather's name was Martin Anderson. He was 72 years old that morning, a widower who'd lost my grandmother 5 years earlier to breast cancer. He'd raised his only daughter, Diane, by himself after that. He worked as an accountant for a small firm in suburban Pennsylvania, lived in a modest 3-bedroom house with a yard that always needed mowing, and spent his weekends doing crossword puzzles and watching baseball. He wasn't expecting to raise another child. But when he picked me up from that car seat, looked at my face, and saw me staring back at him, he made a decision that changed both our lives. He brought me inside, called his lawyer, and started the process of making sure I'd never end up in foster care. My grandfather never badmouthed my parents. When I was old enough to ask where my mom and dad were, he'd just say some people aren't meant to be parents. And that's okay. He said the important thing was that I was loved and taken care of. And I was. Martin raised me like I was his own son. He taught me to tie my shoes, ride a bike, throw a baseball. He sat through every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every soccer game. We didn't have much money. Martin's accounting job paid the bills, but there wasn't extra for fancy vacations or expensive toys. I wore hand-me-downs from garage sales and ate packed lunches every day. But I never felt poor. I felt rich in the ways that mattered. My grandfather was there every single day. He helped me with homework at the kitchen table. He made me pancakes on Saturday mornings. He told me I could be anything I wanted if I worked hard enough. When I was 16, I got curious. I started searching online for Roger and Diane. It didn't take long to find them. They'd moved to California, had 2 more kids, and from what I could see on social media, they were living a comfortable life. Nice house, new cars, family photos at Disneyland. They looked happy. They looked like a family. I showed my grandfather what I'd found. He sat me down and asked if I wanted to reach out to them. I said I didn't know. He told me it was my choice, but I should be prepared for disappointment. I decided not to contact them. What would I even say? Why did you keep the other kids but not me? I threw myself into school instead. I graduated with honors, got accepted to Penn State, and studied civil engineering. My grandfather was so proud. He worked part-time at a grocery store during my college years to help with expenses, even though he was in his 80s by then. I told him he didn't have to, but he insisted. He said investing in my education was the best thing he could do with his money. I graduated, got a job at a firm in Philadelphia, and met Christine at a work conference when I was 26. We got married 2 years later. Martin walked me down the aisle. He told me that day that I'd turned out better than he ever could have hoped, and that raising me was the greatest privilege of his life. 4 years ago, when I was 28, Martin started feeling sick. He ignored it for months, typical stubborn old man. By the time I convinced him to see a doctor, it was bad. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. The doctor said 6 months, maybe less. Those 6 months were the hardest of my life. I watched the strongest man I'd ever known fade away. He moved into our guest room so Christine and I could take care of him. We hired nurses, made him comfortable, spent every moment we could by his side. 3 weeks before he died, something happened that changed everything. A lawyer showed up at our house with a briefcase full of documents. His name was Thomas Garrett, and he'd been managing my grandfather's financial affairs for 15 years. I had no idea my grandfather even had a financial advisor. Thomas sat us down in the living room and explained that Martin had been quietly investing for decades. Every extra dollar he made went into stocks, bonds, real estate. He lived frugally, almost miserly, but he was building something. By the time he got sick, my grandfather's portfolio was worth $3.9 million. I couldn't believe it. $3.9 million. Martin had lived in that same modest house, drove the same old truck, wore the same worn-out sweaters, and the whole time he was a millionaire. Thomas said Martin wanted to make sure his affairs were in order before he died. He'd updated his will, and everything was going to me. The house, the investments, the savings accounts, all of it. Thomas handed me the documents to review. That night, after Thomas left, I sat with my grandfather. He was weak, barely able to sit up, but his mind was sharp. I asked him why he never told me about the money. He smiled and said he didn't want it to change how I saw him or how I lived my life. He said money was just a tool, and he wanted to make sure I learned to work hard and value the right things before I knew about it. Then his expression got serious. He grabbed my hand and looked me straight in the eye. He said, "Brad, I need you to promise me something. Your parents are going to come. They always do when there's money involved. When they show up, and they will, I need you to fight for this. Don't give them a dime. You earned this by being here, by being my son. Promise me you'll fight." I promised. I told him I'd fight for it, no matter what. 2 days after Martin's funeral, Roger and Diane showed up at my door with a lawyer. I was sitting in my living room when the doorbell rang. Christine was at work. I was alone, still in the fog of grief, trying to figure out how to go back to normal life after losing the only parent I'd ever known. I opened the door, and there they were. I recognized them immediately from the photos I'd seen online. Roger was 48, balding, wearing an expensive charcoal suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. Diane was 47, thin, with highlighted hair and makeup that looked professionally done. She wore a designer dress and had jewelry that caught the afternoon light, diamonds on her ears, wrist, and fingers. Behind them stood a man in his 50s, also in a suit, carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Marcus Thornton, attorney at law. Diane spoke first. She didn't say hello or offer condolences. She said, "We need to talk about Dad's estate." I just stared at her. This woman, who I hadn't seen or heard from in 32 years, was standing on my doorstep calling Martin Dad. I asked her what she wanted. Roger stepped forward. He said they'd heard about the will and they thought there must have been some mistake. He said it didn't make sense for Martin to leave everything to me when Diane was his actual daughter. He used that word, actual, like it erased everything Martin and I had been to each other. Marcus, the lawyer, handed me a business card. He said they were hoping to resolve this amicably. He suggested we sit down, maybe agree to split the estate fairly, avoid any unpleasantness. I looked at the three of them standing there, and something inside me snapped. I told them to get off my property. I said if Martin wanted them to have anything, he would have left it to them. He didn't. That was his choice. Diane's face changed. The fake sweetness disappeared. She said I had no idea what I was talking about, that Martin was her father, not mine, and she had rights. She said I'd manipulated a sick old man and stolen what belonged to her family. I told them again to leave. Roger started to argue, but I cut him off. I said if they wanted a fight, they'd get one, but they needed to leave my house right now. Marcus put his hand on Roger's shoulder and said they'd be in touch. The three of them walked back to their BMW and drove away. I called Christine immediately. She came home early from work. We sat together trying to process what had just happened. She asked if I thought they were serious. I said I didn't know, but I remembered my grandfather's warning. He'd been right. They came for the money. 3 weeks later, I received a certified letter from Marcus Thornton's law firm. Inside was a lawsuit. Roger and Diane were suing me for the entire estate, all $3.9 million. The lawsuit was 23 pages long. It claimed that Martin had been suffering from dementia and cognitive decline in his final years. It alleged that I'd isolated him from his family, specifically from Diane, and that I'd used undue influence to manipulate him into changing his will. It claimed the will was invalid because Martin wasn't of sound mind when he signed it. I read the whole thing twice, feeling sicker with each page. They were calling my grandfather mentally incompetent. They were accusing me of elder abuse. None of it was true, but there it was, filed in court, a matter of public record. I knew I needed a lawyer. I asked around and got a referral to Patrick Hayes, an estate litigation attorney with 20 years of experience. I met him in his office downtown. He was in his 50s, gray hair, kind eyes, and a no-nonsense demeanor. I showed him the lawsuit. Patrick read through it carefully, then looked up at me. He said this was going to be expensive and emotionally draining. He said estate litigation could drag on for years and cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees. He asked if I was prepared for that. I told him about my promise to Martin. I said I'd spend every penny fighting this if I had to. Patrick nodded. He said we'd need to gather evidence. Medical records proving Martin was mentally competent. Witnesses who could testify about our relationship. Documentation of the will signing. Financial records showing I hadn't stolen or misused Martin's money. He said it would be a lot of work, but we had a strong case. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into preparing. I contacted Martin's doctors and got copies of all his medical records from the last 5 years. Every test, every appointment, every note. The records were clear. Martin had been sharp as a tack, right up until the final weeks, when the cancer made him too weak to do much of anything. But there was no evidence of dementia, no cognitive decline, nothing that suggested he wasn't capable of making his own decisions. I reached out to neighbors, friends, people from Martin's church. I asked if they'd be willing to testify about the kind of person Martin was and the relationship he and I had. Almost everyone said yes. They remembered Martin as independent, intelligent, and devoted to me. I gathered photos, cards, letters, anything that documented our relationship over the years. I found my old report cards with Martin's signatures, programs from school events he'd attended, birthday cards he'd given me, 32 years of proof that he'd been my father in every way that mattered. Patrick filed our response to the lawsuit, denying all allegations and asserting that the will was valid. We were ready to fight. Then Marcus Thornton sent over discovery documents, and everything got worse. In the pile of papers was a photocopy of a handwritten letter allegedly from Martin. It was dated 8 months before his death, 6 months before he got sick. The letter was addressed to Diane. In it, Martin supposedly expressed deep regret about their estrangement. He wrote about wanting to reconcile, about feeling guilty for taking sides after she left me on his doorstep. He said he'd been too harsh, that everyone makes mistakes, and that he wanted to make things right before it was too late. The letter went on to say he was planning to change his will to include Diane and Roger, to make sure everyone was taken care of. The final line said, "I hope Brad will understand. He's had everything I could give him. It's time to help the rest of the family too." I read that letter 3 times, and I knew immediately it was fake. Martin never wrote that. He would never have said those things. But it was there, in black and white, with what looked like his signature at the bottom. Patrick called me into his office. He looked worried. He said if that letter was authentic, it could destroy our case. It suggested Martin wanted to change his will but didn't get the chance, possibly because I prevented him from doing so. Combined with the allegations of undue influence, it painted a picture of me as controlling and manipulative. I told Patrick the letter was forged. He believed me, but he said proving it would be nearly impossible. We'd need a handwriting expert, and even then, experts disagree all the time. The letter was good enough to create reasonable doubt about Martin's intentions. I left Patrick's office feeling like the ground was crumbling under my feet. My parents hadn't just hired a lawyer, they'd hired someone willing to fabricate evidence. This wasn't a legal dispute anymore. It was war. The lawsuit became public record, and somehow the media got hold of it. A local news station ran a story with the headline, "Elderly Man's Estate Sparks Family Feud." They interviewed Roger and Diane, who played their parts perfectly. Diane sat in front of the camera with tears in her eyes, talking about how she'd made a terrible mistake 32 years ago. She said she'd been young, scared, overwhelmed, and she'd given up her baby in a moment of weakness she'd regretted every day since. She said she'd stayed away because she thought it was what Martin wanted, that she'd been trying to respect his wishes and give me a stable life. She said that when her father got sick, she tried to reach out, but I wouldn't let her see him. She claimed I'd changed his phone number, refused to return her calls, and kept her away while he was dying. She said all she wanted now was to honor her father's true wishes, which she believed included taking care of his entire family. Roger backed her up. He talked about being flawed, about making mistakes, but always loving Martin from afar. He said they weren't after money for themselves. They just wanted to make sure Martin's legacy was distributed fairly, that his grandchildren, my half-siblings, got their share. The reporter asked me for comment. I declined. Patrick had advised me not to talk to the media, so the story ran with just their side, and it made me look cold, greedy, and controlling. The story spread online. Local news turned into regional news. People who didn't know me or Martin started weighing in. Comment sections filled up with strangers calling me heartless for keeping a dying man from his daughter. They said I was only interested in the money. Some said I probably did manipulate Martin, that old people are vulnerable and family members take advantage all the time. I started getting messages on social media. Most were hateful. People sent me paragraphs about what a terrible person I was. Some threatened me. One message said I'd get what was coming to me. Another said karma would catch up eventually. My employer got pulled into it. 3 clients called the firm asking if I was the same Brad involved in that estate dispute they'd seen on the news. One client, a major commercial developer we'd been working with for 2 years, sent an email saying they were concerned about my character and were considering taking their business elsewhere. My boss called me into his office. He said he believed in me, but the negative attention was becoming a problem. He asked if there was any way to settle the lawsuit quickly and quietly. I told him I wasn't settling. He sighed and said he hoped it would blow over soon. Even Christine's parents started questioning things. Her mother called one night and asked if maybe Roger and Diane had a point. She said family is family, and maybe Martin really had wanted to reconcile. Christine defended me, but I could hear the doubt in her mother's voice. It hurt more than the strangers online. Then my half-siblings got involved. I'd never met them. The boy was 24, the girl was 22. They both posted on social media about their stolen inheritance. The girl, Ashley, wrote a long post about how her grandpa Martin had always sent them birthday cards when they were little, how he'd loved them, and how it was wrong that some stranger got everything. The post went viral in our local community. Hundreds of shares, thousands of comments. I wanted to respond, to defend myself, but Patrick warned me again. He said anything I said publicly could be used against me in court. So I stayed silent while my reputation got torn apart. The pressure was crushing. I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake at night replaying everything, wondering if I should just give them half the money and make it stop. Christine would find me at 2 a.m, sitting in the dark, staring at nothing. Work became unbearable. Colleagues who used to chat with me in the break room started avoiding eye contact. I heard whispers when I walked past. The developer who'd threatened to pull their contract did exactly that, costing my firm $300,000 in revenue. My boss didn't fire me, but he moved me off major projects. I was being sidelined. One morning, I got a call from Patrick. His voice was tense. He said Marcus Thornton had filed new discovery, and I needed to come to his office immediately. I drove downtown, my stomach in knots. Patrick met me in the conference room with papers spread across the table. He said Marcus had hired a forensic accountant to review Martin's financial records. The accountant had identified suspicious withdrawals from Martin's accounts during his final year. $87,000 taken out in chunks over 12 months. The accountant's report suggested these withdrawals were unusual and potentially indicated financial exploitation. Combined with the allegations of undue influence, Marcus was building a case that I'd been stealing from Martin while he was sick. I felt the blood drain from my face. I told Patrick those withdrawals were legitimate. They were for Martin's cancer treatments, for home modifications so he could stay comfortable, for the nurses we hired. Everything was documented. Patrick said he knew that, and we'd prove it. But the damage was done. Marcus had already filed a motion accusing me of financial elder abuse. The court would have to investigate. 2 days later, I got a knock on my door. It was a woman from Adult Protective Services. She said they'd received a complaint, alleging I'd abused and financially exploited my grandfather. She said they were opening an investigation. I stood there, unable to speak. This wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. If APS found evidence of abuse, I could face criminal charges. I could lose my engineering license. My entire career could be over. The APS investigator asked to come inside. She spent 2 hours interviewing me and Christine, asking about Martin's care, the financial transactions, our relationship. She was professional but thorough. She said the investigation would take several weeks. After she left, I sat on the couch and put my head in my hands. Christine sat next to me, crying. She said this was insane, that they were destroying us. I thought about Martin's promise. I told him I'd fight, but I hadn't known the fight would cost me everything. My job was hanging by a thread. My reputation was ruined. Strangers hated me. Now I was under investigation for elder abuse. Even if I was eventually cleared, the damage might be permanent. I considered settling, giving Roger and Diane half, maybe even all of it, just to make it stop. But every time I thought about it, I remembered Martin's face in those final days. I remembered his hand gripping mine. Promise me you'll fight. Don't give them a dime. I couldn't break that promise, even if it destroyed me. The next 3 weeks were the worst of my life. The APS investigation hung over everything like a dark cloud. The investigator interviewed neighbors, former nurses, Martin's doctors, anyone who'd been around during his final year. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, but investigations don't care about truth. They care about what can be proven or disproven, and sometimes innocent people get caught in the machinery. I lost 15 pounds. I couldn't eat. Food tasted like cardboard. Christine would make dinner, and I'd push it around my plate until she stopped trying. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning with my heart racing, panic attacks that left me gasping for air on the bathroom floor. Christine would find me there and hold me until I could breathe again. My engineering license was put under review pending the outcome of the investigation. My boss called me in and said the firm had to put me on unpaid leave. He apologized, said his hands were tied, but the optics were too bad. I cleaned out my desk while former friends and colleagues pretended not to watch. Patrick was working around the clock, but even he looked worried. He'd filed motions, gathered documentation proving every single withdrawal was legitimate, tracked down receipts for medical equipment, payment records for nurses, everything. But Marcus kept throwing up roadblocks, filing extensions, dragging things out. The judge scheduled a preliminary hearing to review the elder abuse allegations before the main estate trial. Patrick said if we could get the abuse allegations dismissed, we'd be in a better position for the estate case. But if the judge found enough evidence to let the investigation continue, we were in serious trouble. Christine stood by me, but I could see the strain on her face. We'd burned through $20,000 in legal fees already, and we were just getting started. Our savings account was bleeding out. She never complained, never suggested I give up. But I saw her crying in the shower when she thought I couldn't hear. One night, I told her maybe we should settle. Maybe I should give them half the estate, keep the other half, and move on with our lives. She looked at me with red eyes and said if that's what I wanted, she'd support me. But then she asked if I could live with breaking my promise to Martin. I couldn't. That was the answer. I couldn't look at myself in the mirror if I gave in to them. So I decided to see it through, whatever the cost. The preliminary hearing was set for a Friday morning. Patrick spent the week before preparing, rehearsing questions, organizing evidence. He said we had a solid case, but judges were unpredictable. Elder abuse was taken seriously, and even unfounded allegations could stick. The night before the hearing, I was sitting at my computer going through emails when a new message popped up. The subject line said, "Your parents aren't who they claim to be." The sender was an anonymous email address, just random letters and numbers. I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam or another angry stranger, but something made me open it. The email was short. It said, "You need to see this. I hired a private investigator to look into Roger and Diane. You deserve to know the truth. The attachment contains everything. Use it wisely. There was a link to a secure file sharing site. My hands were shaking as I clicked it. A PDF downloaded, 73 pages long. The header said Private Investigation Report. Roger Chen and Diane Chen. I started reading, and my entire world tilted. The report was thorough, professionally done. It detailed Roger and Diane's lives going back 15 years. According to the investigator, 12 years ago, Diane had sued her aunt in Arizona over an estate. The aunt had died and left her property to a cousin. Diane claimed the aunt had been mentally incompetent and that the cousin had manipulated her. The lawsuit alleged undue influence, almost word for word the same claims being made about me now. That case had settled out of court. Diane got $75,000. The cousin, who'd been caring for the aunt for years, gave up just to end the legal battle. The report went deeper. Roger had a serious gambling problem. He owed money to multiple creditors, had maxed out credit cards, and was behind on their mortgage. The total debt was around $140,000. Diane ran an online boutique that was hemorrhaging money, $300,000 in debt and sinking fast. Their 2 kids, my half-siblings, had been promised college funds that no longer existed. Roger and Diane had drained the accounts to cover their lifestyle and debts. But the most damning part was at the end of the report. Phone records. Marcus Thornton and Roger had been in contact 6 months before Martin died. Multiple calls, some lasting 20 or 30 minutes. This was long before the will was even read, before Martin had passed away. They'd been planning this lawsuit while Martin was still alive. I read the report 3 times, each time feeling my chest get tighter. These people weren't grieving family members trying to honor Martin's wishes. They were con artists who'd done this before and saw an opportunity to do it again. I didn't know who'd hired the private investigator or why they were helping me, but I didn't care. I forwarded the report to Patrick immediately with a message. "Call me first thing in the morning." Patrick called at 7. I'd been awake all night. He said he'd read the report, and it was explosive. This proved a pattern of behavior, proved financial desperation, and most importantly, proved premeditation. Marcus and Roger planning the lawsuit before Martin died meant they'd been strategizing how to challenge the will before anyone even knew what was in it. Patrick said he'd bring this to the preliminary hearing. It would blow their case apart. I felt hope for the first time in weeks. Maybe, just maybe, we could win this. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning. Christine and I arrived at the courthouse at 8:30. Patrick met us outside with his briefcase, looking confident for the first time since this whole nightmare started. He said he'd filed the private investigator's report with the court that morning and sent a copy to Marcus Thornton. He expected Marcus to be rattled, maybe even to approach us about settling before we went in front of the judge. We walked into the courthouse, through security, and headed toward the courtroom. That's when I saw them, Roger and Diane, standing in the hallway with Marcus. Diane was wearing a black dress that probably cost $1,000, looking like she was attending a funeral. Roger wore a dark suit, his expression serious. When Diane saw me, she rolled her eyes. Actually rolled her eyes, like I was a child throwing a tantrum. The gesture was so casual, so dismissive, that it took my breath away. This woman was trying to destroy my life, and she looked annoyed that I was inconveniencing her. Marcus saw us approach and stepped forward. He didn't look rattled at all. In fact, he looked calm, almost amused. He handed Patrick a folder and said, "You might want to review this before we go inside." Patrick opened the folder. His face changed. He looked at Marcus, then at me, then back at Marcus. He asked for a moment to confer with his client. We stepped into an empty conference room. Patrick showed me what Marcus had given him. It was a motion to exclude the private investigator's report from evidence. The motion argued that the report had been obtained through illegal means, potentially violating privacy laws. It also claimed that any communications between Marcus and Roger were protected by attorney-client privilege and couldn't be used against them. Patrick said this was a problem. If the judge agreed with Marcus, we'd lose our best evidence. He said we could argue against the motion, but there was no guarantee we'd win. We walked into the courtroom at 5 minutes to 9. The judge, Margaret Sullivan, was already on the bench. She was in her early 60s, gray hair pulled back tight, wire-rimmed glasses, and an expression that suggested she'd seen everything and wasn't impressed by any of it. She had a reputation for being strict, by the book, and intolerant of games. The preliminary hearing started with Marcus's motion. He argued smoothly, citing case law about illegally obtained evidence and attorney-client privilege. He said the private investigator's report was the fruit of a poisonous tree, obtained without proper authorization, and should be excluded entirely. Patrick countered, arguing that the evidence was crucial to establishing a pattern of fraudulent behavior. He said the phone records were public information obtained legally, and the rest of the report was based on publicly available documents. Judge Sullivan listened to both sides, her expression neutral. Then she made her ruling. She said she was inclined to agree with Marcus. Without knowing who hired the private investigator and how the information was obtained, she couldn't verify its legitimacy. She excluded most of the report, allowing only the publicly available court records about the Arizona lawsuit to remain. I felt my stomach drop. We just lost our best evidence. The hearing continued. The APS investigator took the stand first. She was a middle-aged woman named Linda Warren, professional and matter-of-fact. She testified about the complaint she'd received, the investigation she'd conducted, and the concerns that had been raised. She talked about the $87,000 in withdrawals. She said interviews with some of Martin's neighbors revealed that they rarely saw Roger or Diane visit during Martin's final years. One neighbor said she'd never seen Diane at all. Another said Martin had mentioned once that his daughter lived far away and they weren't close. On cross-examination, Patrick tried to establish that the withdrawals were all legitimate and documented. Linda agreed the receipts and records I'd provided showed the money went to medical expenses and care. But she said the investigation was ongoing, and there were still questions about whether Martin had been competent to authorize those expenditures. Judge Sullivan asked Linda if she'd found any direct evidence of abuse or exploitation. Linda admitted she hadn't, but said the investigation wasn't complete. Then Roger took the stand. Marcus had coached him well. Roger testified that he'd always loved Martin, considered him a father figure, even though they weren't related by blood. He said Martin had helped him and Diane early in their marriage, and they'd stayed in touch over the years. He admitted they'd made mistakes, that giving up their baby was something they regretted deeply. But he said they'd stayed away because Martin asked them to, because Martin thought it was better for me to have stability. He said they'd respected Martin's wishes, even though it broke their hearts. He talked about trying to reach out when Martin got sick. He claimed they'd called multiple times, sent letters, tried to visit, but I'd blocked them at every turn. He said he understood I was protective, but keeping them away from Martin in his final days was cruel. Patrick cross-examined him, asking for proof of these calls and letters. Roger said he didn't keep records, that they were personal family matters. Patrick asked why, if they were so concerned about Martin, they'd hired an attorney before Martin even died. Roger stumbled, said he'd consulted Marcus for advice on family matters, nothing more. Judge Sullivan looked skeptical, but she let it go. Then Diane took the stand. She cried, real tears streaming down her face. She talked about the unbearable pain of giving up her baby. She said she thought about me every single day, wondered if I was okay, hoped I was happy. She said Martin had told her years ago that I was doing well, that she'd made the right choice in letting him raise me. She said when Martin got sick, she wanted to see him one last time, to tell him she was sorry for the burden she'd placed on him, to thank him for everything. But I wouldn't let her. She said she called the house, and I hung up on her. She said she drove all the way from California once, showed up at the house, and I threatened to call the police if she didn't leave. None of this was true. She'd never called, never visited, never tried to see Martin. But she was convincing. Her voice broke at all the right moments. She looked directly at Judge Sullivan with those tear-filled eyes and said all she wanted was to honor her father's memory and make sure his wishes were respected. Patrick cross-examined her, asking for phone records proving she'd called. She said she'd called from different numbers, borrowed phones, that she didn't have records. Patrick asked why she'd waited until after Martin died to file a lawsuit. She said she didn't know about the will until then, didn't know I'd taken everything. Judge Sullivan called for a short recess. Patrick and I stepped into the hallway. He looked worried. He said Roger and Diane were giving good testimony, And without the PI report, we were in a tough spot. He said judges tended to be sympathetic to parents, especially mothers who showed remorse. When we reconvened, Marcus said he had one more witness. He called Gloria Bennett to the stand. Gloria was in her 50s, heavyset, with short curly hair and a nurse's scrubs under a cardigan. She was sworn in and testified that she'd been one of the home health aides who cared for Martin in his final months. She said Martin was often confused, didn't always recognize people, and had difficulty making decisions. She said I was controlling, dismissive of Martin's needs, and frequently rude to the medical staff. She claimed Martin had asked for Diane several times, said he missed his daughter and wanted to see her. She said I told Martin that Diane didn't care about him, that she'd abandoned the family and wouldn't come. Gloria testified that Martin cried when I said this, that he seemed hurt and confused. Patrick cross-examined her. He asked which agency she worked for. Gloria named a home health company. Patrick asked for her employee ID number. She hesitated, then gave a number. Patrick wrote it down and said he'd be verifying her employment. He asked specific questions about Martin's care. What medications was he on? What were his daily routines? Gloria answered some questions correctly, but others she stumbled on. Patrick pressed harder, and Gloria got defensive. Judge Sullivan interrupted and said she'd heard enough. She thanked Gloria and dismissed her. Then Judge Sullivan addressed both attorneys. She said she'd reviewed all the evidence and testimony. She said the allegations of elder abuse were serious and warranted continued investigation. She wasn't dismissing the APS complaint. She said the estate trial would proceed as scheduled in 3 weeks, and the abuse investigation would be resolved before then. She also said she was troubled by some of the testimony she'd heard, particularly about the relationship between Martin and his daughter. She said families were complicated, and it was clear there were deep wounds on all sides. Patrick tried to object, to argue that we'd provided evidence disproving the abuse allegations. Judge Sullivan cut him off. She said her ruling stood. Court was adjourned. Marcus and his clients left looking satisfied. Roger put his arm around Diane, who was still crying softly. They looked like the victims. Patrick and I walked out in silence. When we got to his car, he said we needed to talk. He looked pale. He said he'd already started checking on Gloria Bennett. He'd called the home health agency she claimed to work for. They had no record of a Gloria Bennett ever being employed there. The employee ID number she'd given was fake. Patrick pulled out his phone and showed me what he'd found. He'd done a quick online search during the recess. Gloria Bennett wasn't a nurse. She was an actress with a minor criminal record for fraud. She'd been in a few community theater productions and had been arrested 5 years ago for a credit card scam. She was a fake, a paid witness, testifying to things that never happened. Patrick said this was huge. We could prove Marcus had put a fraudulent witness on the stand. We could get the case thrown out, maybe even get Marcus disbarred. But there was a problem. Proving it before the main trial in 3 weeks would be nearly impossible. We'd need to track down Gloria, get her to admit she was paid to lie, or find a paper trail connecting her to Marcus or Roger. That kind of investigation took time, and we were out of time. I asked what our options were. Patrick said we could file an emergency motion, alert the judge that we suspected perjury, and request a delay. But without hard proof, Judge Sullivan might not believe us. And delaying the trial would cost more money, more time, more stress. Or we could keep digging, try to find the proof we needed in the next 3 weeks, and blow up Marcus's case at trial. Patrick said either way, we were fighting an uphill battle. Marcus had outmaneuvered us, and even with a fake witness, the damage was done. Judge Sullivan seemed inclined to believe Roger and Diane's story. I sat in the passenger seat of Patrick's car, staring out the window at the courthouse. People were walking in and out, dealing with divorces, custody battles, traffic tickets, all the mundane machinery of the legal system. My life was being decided in that building, and I was losing. Patrick dropped me off at home. Christine was waiting. I told her everything. She held me while I cried for the first time since this whole thing started. I cried for Martin, for the promise I'd made, for the fight I was losing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Gloria on the stand, lying so easily, so convincingly. I thought about Marcus, willing to break the law to win. I thought about Roger and Diane, who'd abandoned me, but were now playing the role of grieving family. I thought about giving up, about walking into Patrick's office and telling him to settle. Give them the estate. All of it. Just make it stop. But then I thought about Martin's face in those final days, his hand gripping mine. Promise me you'll fight. I'd made a promise. And even if it destroyed me, I was going to keep it. The next morning, I was at the kitchen table drinking coffee, trying to figure out how to survive the next 3 weeks. Christine had gone to work. I was still on unpaid leave. My days an empty stretch of anxiety and waiting. My laptop was open, email pulled up. I refreshed it out of habit, not expecting anything. A new message appeared. The sender was the same anonymous email address that had sent the private investigator's report. The subject line said, "Check Martin's storage unit. Unit 23. Password is your birthday." I stared at the screen. Storage unit? Martin never mentioned having a storage unit. I'd gone through all his paperwork after he died, sorted through his house, dealt with his estate. There'd been no mention of any storage facility. I called Christine. She came home during her lunch break. I showed her the email. She asked if I thought it was legitimate or some kind of trap. I said I didn't know, but we had to check. We drove to the address listed in the email, a storage facility about 30 miles outside the city. It was one of those big complexes with rows of orange metal units, security cameras, and a keypad entry system. I went to the office. A young guy sat behind the counter playing on his phone. I asked if there was a unit registered under Martin Anderson's name. He checked his computer and said yes, Unit 23, paid up through the end of the year. I told him I was Martin's grandson and I needed access. He asked for ID and proof of relation. I showed him my driver's license and Martin's death certificate, which I'd started carrying everywhere. He said normally he'd need more documentation, but since the account was current and I was listed as an emergency contact, he'd let me in. He gave me the gate code and directions to Unit 23. Christine and I walked through the facility until we found it. The unit was mid-sized, maybe 10 feet by 20 feet, with a rolling metal door and a keypad lock. I entered my birthday, 0415. The lock clicked. The door rolled up. Inside were boxes, dozens of them, stacked neatly, all labeled in Martin's careful handwriting. Photo albums, financial records, personal papers, medical documents. Some boxes were dated, going back decades. Christine and I started going through them. The first box I opened was labeled journals. Inside were notebooks, spiral-bound, filled with Martin's handwriting. I opened one at random. It was dated March of the year I was born, March 15th. Diane came by today asking for money again. She's 3 months pregnant and says Roger lost his job. I offered to help with food and bills, but she wanted cash. $2,000. I said no. She got angry. Said I never supported her, that I was a terrible father. Maybe she's right. Maybe if I'd done better, she wouldn't be in this situation. I kept reading. Entry after entry of Martin documenting his relationship with Diane. The fights, the requests for money, the disappointments, and then the entry from the day I was left on his doorstep. November 2nd. Found a baby on my doorstep this morning. My grandson, Diane and Roger left him with a note. They said they're not ready to be parents. I'm 72 years old. I shouldn't be raising another child. But when I looked at him, I couldn't turn him away. His name is Brad. He's my responsibility now. I read through years of journals. Martin wrote about raising me, about the challenges and the joys. He wrote about every milestone. First steps, first words, first day of school. He wrote about his worries, about whether he was doing enough, whether he'd lived long enough to see me grown. And he wrote about Diane. She called again asking for money. I said no. She hasn't asked about Brad once. Roger showed up drunk, demanding I give them $5,000. I told him to leave and not come back. There were dozens of entries documenting Roger and Diane's requests for money over the years. Martin always refused. He wrote about how they only ever contacted him when they wanted something, never to ask about me, never to see how I was doing. Christine found another box labeled legal documents. Inside were copies of letters. One was from 8 years ago, from Diane. It was typed, signed at the bottom, The letter said, "Dad, I know we haven't been close, but I'm in trouble. Roger's business failed, and we're facing bankruptcy. I need $75,000. If you can help us, I promise I'll stay out of Brad's life forever. You won't hear from us again. Please, I'm begging you." Martin's response was paperclipped to the letter. He'd written, "Diane, I've helped you more times than I can count. I've given you money, paid your debts, bailed you out. It never changes anything. You always come back asking for more. I won't give you $75,000, and I won't accept your promise to stay out of Brad's life as a bargaining chip. He's my son, and you gave up your right to be his mother 32 years ago. Do not contact me again unless you're ready to apologize and make amends." There was no record of Diane ever responding. I kept digging through boxes, financial records showing every penny Martin earned and invested, medical documents proving his sound mind, letters from friends and neighbors. Everything documented, everything preserved. Then I found a box labeled Video Diary. Inside were a dozen VHS tapes, all dated from the last year of Martin's life. I didn't have a VCR, but Christine said her parents still had one. We loaded everything into the car and drove to her parents' house. Christine's father set up the VCR while her mother made coffee. We sat in their living room and put in the first tape. Martin appeared on the screen, sitting in his living room, looking thin and tired. The date stamp said it was recorded 9 months before he died, 3 months before he got sick. Martin spoke directly to the camera. He said, "My name is Martin Anderson. I'm 89 years old, and I'm making this recording because I want there to be a record of my thoughts and intentions. I know my daughter Diane, and I know that when I die, she'll come for whatever I leave behind. I want it to be clear that I am of sound mind and body as I make these statements." He went on to detail his relationship with Diane, the abandonment, the years of requests for money, the lack of contact. He talked about raising me, about how proud he was of the man I'd become. He explained why he was leaving everything to me. He said, "Brad earned this, not through manipulation or coercion, but by being here, by showing up every day, by being my son in every way that matters. Diane had 32 years to be a mother. She chose not to be. That was her decision, and she has to live with the consequences." Martin looked directly into the camera, his eyes clear and sharp. He said, "If Roger and Diane come for this money after I'm gone, it will prove I was right about them all along. They don't care about family. They care about money. And I won't let them profit from abandoning the one person who mattered most to me." There were 11 more tapes, all similar. Martin documenting his state of mind, his intentions, his reasons. It was heartbreaking and powerful. Christine's mother was crying. Her father sat quietly, looking stunned. Christine held my hand so tight it hurt. We copied the tapes to digital files. This was the evidence we needed. This proved Martin's competence, his intentions, and his understanding of exactly what Diane would do. But as we were packing up to leave, I found one more document in the bottom of the legal box. It was an official-looking paper, stamped and notarized, dated 32 years ago. It was an adoption certificate. Martin had legally adopted me 6 months after Diane left me on his doorstep. The document changed my legal status from grandson to son. Martin wasn't my grandfather. Legally, he was my father. And that meant Diane wasn't his daughter anymore in the eyes of the law. The adoption had transferred parental rights entirely. I showed the document to Christine. She read it, then looked at me with wide eyes. She said, "This changes everything." I called Patrick immediately. He was at his office. I told him what we'd found. He said to bring everything to him right away. We drove straight there. Patrick's eyes got wider and wider as he went through the materials. The journals, the letters, the video recordings, and then the adoption certificate. He said, "Brad, this is it. This is the case. If Martin legally adopted you, then you're not his grandson. You're his son. Diane's entire lawsuit is based on her being Martin's daughter and direct heir. But if you're legally his son, then you're the direct heir, and Diane has no standing." I asked if we could prove the adoption was legitimate. Patrick said adoption records were public, but the courthouse where this was filed had a fire 20 years ago that destroyed a lot of old records. We'd need to authenticate the document. find corroborating evidence, track down anyone involved in the process. He said we had less than 2 weeks before trial. It would be tight, but if we could prove this adoption was real, we'd win. Not just win, we'd destroy their entire case. Patrick started making calls. He contacted the judge who'd signed the adoption order. The judge was 91 years old, retired, living in a nursing home. Patrick drove out to see him the next day. The judge remembered the case. He said Martin had come to him worried about his grandson's future, wanting to make sure the boy would never end up in foster care if something happened. The judge provided a notarized affidavit confirming he'd signed the adoption order. Patrick tracked down the social worker who'd processed the adoption. She was still alive, 73 years old, living in Florida. She remembered Martin and me. She said Martin had been one of the most devoted parents she'd ever worked with, even though he was technically a grandparent. She agreed to testify. Patrick hired a forensic document examiner to verify the adoption certificate's authenticity. The examiner confirmed the paper, ink, and stamps were all consistent with documents from that time period. The signatures matched records on file. It was legitimate. We spent the next 10 days preparing. Patrick built a case around the adoption, the video diaries, the journals, the financial records, all of it. We had everything we needed to prove Martin's competence, his intentions, and most importantly, that I was his legal son and sole rightful heir. But we still hadn't figured out who the anonymous emailer was. Someone had hired that private investigator. Someone had told us about the storage unit. Someone was helping us from the shadows. Patrick said it didn't matter. What mattered was, we had what we needed to win. The trial date arrived. It was a Tuesday morning. Christine and I got dressed in our best clothes. She wore a navy dress. I wore the suit I'd gotten married in. We drove to the courthouse, and I felt strangely calm. This was it. The final battle. Win or lose, it would be over soon. The courtroom was packed. I hadn't expected that. Word had gotten around that this was going to be a significant hearing. I recognized some reporters in the back row, probably hoping for a dramatic story. Patrick was already there, briefcase open, files organized on the table. He looked focused, ready. Roger and Diane arrived with Marcus Thornton. Diane wore a gray suit and minimal makeup, playing the part of the grieving daughter. Roger looked serious, hands folded. They took their seats on the opposite side of the courtroom. I walked down the aisle, and as I passed their table, Diane looked up at me. She rolled her eyes, the same dismissive gesture from the preliminary hearing, like this was all just a tedious inconvenience. I kept walking and sat down next to Patrick. Christine sat in the row behind us. Judge Sullivan entered, and everyone stood. She took her seat, arranged some papers, and looked out at the courtroom. She said, "This is a matter of estate litigation. Anderson estate. Let's proceed." Marcus stood and delivered his opening statement. He painted Roger and Diane as heartbroken parents who'd made mistakes but deserved a second chance. He talked about Martin's alleged incompetence, the suspicious withdrawals, the emotional manipulation. He referenced the letter supposedly from Martin expressing regret. He talked about how family bonds were sacred, and that Diane, as Martin's biological daughter, had a rightful claim to the estate. Then Patrick stood. He thanked Judge Sullivan and said he'd like to present some new evidence that had come to light. He approached the bench and handed the judge a folder. Judge Sullivan opened it. Her eyes scanned the contents. She looked up at Patrick, then at Marcus, then back at the folder. She said, "Counselor, is this authenticated?" Patrick said yes. He explained we'd found the adoption certificate in Martin's storage unit, along with extensive documentation. He said he had the original judge and social worker ready to testify, plus a forensic document examiner to verify authenticity. Judge Sullivan looked at Marcus. She said, "Did you know about this?" Marcus looked blindsided. He said he'd had no knowledge of any adoption. He asked for a recess to review the evidence. Judge Sullivan granted 15 minutes. Marcus, Roger, and Diane huddled in the hallway outside the courtroom. Through the window, I could see Diane's face turning red. Roger was gesturing angrily. Marcus looked like he was trying to calm them down. When we reconvened, Judge Sullivan addressed the courtroom. She said, Before we continue with testimony, I want to clarify something. Mr. Hayes has presented evidence that Martin Anderson legally adopted Brad Anderson 32 years ago. If this adoption is valid, it fundamentally changes the nature of this case. She looked at Marcus. She said, Mr. Thornton, your client's lawsuit is predicated on Miss Chen being Martin Anderson's daughter, and therefore a direct heir. If Brad Anderson is legally Martin's adopted son, then Miss Chen's biological relationship is superseded. Do you dispute the validity of this adoption? Marcus tried to argue. He said the adoption records were from a courthouse that had a fire, that the documents could be fabricated, that without the original court file, they couldn't be verified. Judge Sullivan said she'd hear testimony on the matter. Patrick called the retired judge first. The 91-year-old man walked slowly to the witness stand with the help of a cane. He was sworn in and testified clearly and confidently. He remembered Martin, remembered the adoption, remembered signing the order. He said Martin had been deeply concerned about his grandson's future and wanted to ensure legal protection. Marcus cross-examined him, suggesting his memory might be faulty given his age. The judge bristled. He said, "My memory is fine, counselor. I remember that case because Martin Anderson was one of the most dedicated men I ever met. He didn't have to take that baby in, but he did, and he did it right." Next, Patrick called the social worker. She testified about processing the adoption, about the home visits she'd conducted, about Martin's devotion to me. She said she'd kept personal notes from that time and had brought them with her. The notes documented everything, including Diane's relinquishment of parental rights. Marcus tried to poke holes, but the testimony was solid. Then Patrick introduced the video diaries. He played 3 of them for the court. Martin's voice filled the courtroom, calm and clear, explaining his decisions, his state of mind, his reasons. When the 3rd video ended, the courtroom was silent. Even Judge Sullivan looked moved. Patrick then presented the journals and letters, including Diane's letter from 8 years ago, offering to stay out of my life in exchange for money. He called the forensic document examiner, who testified that the adoption certificate was authentic, that all the paperwork was legitimate. By this point, Marcus looked defeated. He knew his case was falling apart. Judge Sullivan called both attorneys to the bench for a sidebar. I couldn't hear what was said, but Patrick came back looking satisfied. Court recessed for lunch. Patrick told me we were winning. He said Judge Sullivan was clearly leaning in our favor. He said once she ruled on the adoption's validity, the estate case would collapse. We grabbed sandwiches from a deli across the street. I couldn't eat. My stomach was twisted in knots. Christine sat next to me, holding my hand under the table. When we returned, I needed to use the restroom. I walked down the hall and ran into Diane coming out of the women's room. We were alone in the hallway. She looked at me, and for a moment, I saw something in her face. Not remorse, but panic. She knew they were losing. I said, "You had 32 years to be my mother. You chose not to be. And now you've proven exactly why Martin was right to leave you out." She opened her mouth to say something, but Roger appeared, grabbed her arm, and pulled her away. He glared at me as they walked back toward the courtroom. Court resumed. Judge Sullivan said she'd reviewed all the evidence and was ready to make her findings. She said the adoption was valid. She'd examined the certificate, the supporting documents, the testimony from the judge and social worker, and the forensic analysis. She ruled that Martin Anderson had legally adopted Brad Anderson 32 years ago, making Brad his son in the eyes of the law. She said, "This adoption supersedes the biological relationship between Martin Anderson and Diane Chen. At the time of his death, Martin Anderson's legal son was Brad Anderson. Diane Chen, having relinquished parental rights through the adoption process, has no legal standing as an heir." Marcus tried to object. Judge Sullivan cut him off. She said, "Mr. Thornton, your client's entire case is based on a premise that is legally invalid. Miss Chen is not Martin Anderson's daughter in the eyes of the law. Brad Anderson is his son and sole rightful heir as designated in the will." She went further. She said, "I'm also troubled by testimony presented at the preliminary hearing, specifically the testimony of Gloria Bennett. It has come to my attention that Miss Bennett may have provided false testimony. I'm referring this matter to the district attorney for investigation." She looked at Marcus. She said, "Mr. Thornton, knowingly presenting false testimony is a serious matter. I'm sanctioning you for this conduct and referring you to the state bar for disciplinary proceedings." Marcus's face went white. Roger and Diane looked stunned. Judge Sullivan said, "The will of Martin Anderson is valid. The estate goes to Brad Anderson as specified. This case is dismissed with prejudice. The Anderson family is also hereby ordered to pay Mr. Anderson's legal fees and court costs." She banged her gavel. Court adjourned. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. Patrick shook my hand, then pulled me into a hug. Christine was crying, smiling, reaching over the rail to grab my hand. I looked across the courtroom. Marcus was packing up his briefcase, his face red. Roger was arguing with him in harsh whispers. Diane sat frozen, staring at the table in front of her. Then they stood and left, walking quickly out of the courtroom without looking back. Patrick said the district attorney would likely file charges against them for fraud and perjury. The case would be referred, and while he couldn't guarantee they'd face criminal consequences, their reputations were destroyed. Christine and I walked out of the courthouse into afternoon sunshine. The air felt different, lighter. Patrick met us on the steps and told us the APS investigation had been formally dropped. My employer had already called, asking when I could return to work. Over the next few weeks, things settled. Roger and Diane left California and disappeared. Patrick heard through his network that they were trying to avoid the district attorney's investigation. My half-siblings, Ashley and the brother whose name I never learned, reached out through social media. Ashley sent a long message apologizing. She said her parents had lied to them, manipulated them into posting those things online. She said they'd figured out Roger and Diane were in financial trouble and had been using them. I didn't respond. That chapter of my life was closed. I felt no need to open it again. I used part of the inheritance to pay Patrick's fees, which were substantial but worth every penny. Then Christine and I sat down and talked about what to do with the rest. We decided to honor Martin's legacy. We established a scholarship fund in his name for children being raised by grandparents or other relatives. We endowed a legal aid clinic to help grandparents navigate custody and adoption, so other families wouldn't have to go through what Martin did alone. We kept enough to be comfortable, to buy a nice house, to secure our future. But the bulk of the money went toward helping people in situations like mine, kids who needed someone to fight for them, the way Martin fought for me. 6 months after the trial, I visited Martin's grave. It was a sunny Saturday morning. Christine came with me. We brought flowers, white roses, Martin's favorite. The headstone was simple granite, exactly what Martin would have wanted. It read, "Martin Anderson, beloved father." I stood there looking at those words. Beloved father, not grandfather. Father, because that's what he'd been. From the moment he found me on his doorstep, he'd been my father in every way that mattered. I said out loud, I kept my promise. I fought for it. And I won. The wind rustled through the trees. A bird sang somewhere nearby. The moment felt peaceful, complete. Christine squeezed my hand. We stood there for a while longer, then walked back to our car. On the drive home, I thought about everything that had happened. The lawsuit, the lies, the fight. Roger and Diane had tried to steal something that was never theirs. They'd tried to rewrite history, to pretend they'd been devoted family members. They'd brought in fake witnesses, fabricated evidence, dragged my name through the mud. But in the end, the truth won. Not because truth always wins in some fairy tale way, but because Martin had prepared for this. He'd documented everything. He'd made his intentions clear. He'd legally protected me. Even after death, he was still taking care of me. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was proof that family isn't about blood. It's about showing up. It's about being there when it matters. It's about sacrifice and commitment and love. Martin showed me what real family looks like. He could have turned me away that morning, could have called social services, could have decided he was too old to raise another child. But he didn't. He chose me. Every single day for 32 years, he chose me. And when Roger and Diane tried to take that away, To reduce our relationship to a legal technicality they could exploit, they failed. Because you can't steal something that was never really about money in the first place. I thought about the anonymous person who'd helped us, the one who hired the private investigator, who told us about the storage unit, who gave us the tools to win. Patrick eventually figured out who it was. Henry, Martin's former law partner and best friend. He'd promised Martin years ago that if anything happened, he'd look out for me. He'd kept that promise quietly, from the shadows, never asking for credit or recognition. That's what real love looks like. Not grand gestures, but quiet acts of protection and support. I pulled into our driveway. Christine and I went inside. We had dinner, watched a movie, went to bed. Normal life. The life Martin had worked so hard to give me. Before I fell asleep, I thought one more time about the courtroom, about Diane rolling her eyes, about Judge Sullivan's ruling, about walking out into sunshine, finally free. The lesson I learned isn't complicated. Family is who shows up. Family is who stays. Family is who loves you not because they have to, but because they choose to. Blood might bind people together, but it doesn't make them family. Love makes them family. Commitment makes them family. Being there makes them family. Martin was my family, the only family I ever needed. And no amount of money or legal maneuvering could change that. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever had someone in your life who wasn't related by blood but was more family to you than anyone else? Someone who showed up when it mattered, who chose you when they didn't have to. I'd love to hear your stories. Drop a comment below and share your experience. These stories matter. They remind us what really counts. If this story touched you, please hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories and reminds us we're not alone in our struggles. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because I share more real stories about real people fighting for what's right. And please share this with someone who needs to hear it. You never know who might be going through something similar and needs to know there's hope. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here. I hope wherever you are, you're surrounded by people who choose you, who show up for you, who love you the way Martin loved me. That's the real inheritance. Not money, but love. Take care of yourselves. And remember, family isn't about blood. It's about being there.